Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This episode is essentially a part 2 to the previous episode dealing with the texts. We really want to just go into the family dynamics a little bit further. 4 days ago I actually made a live video on the topic, when did the premeditation start? And one of the aspects I sort of queried almost rhetorically was just, is there or were there some kind of family grudges or grudges between in-laws or something like that? And the reason to ask that question is quite simple. If there are grudges, then there's a sense of people being isolated from one another. I'm talking about a family member is already isolated from other family members in terms of their interactions. In other words, they don't interact regularly, they don't see one another regularly, and so what that does is it provides an opportunity, certainly in the mind of the potential perpetrator. They sort of sniff an opportunity for foul play. Does that make sense? So when you are looking for something like that, grudges, prior what I call social death, it's basically where you, in a social sense, in a societal sense, almost die ahead of the actual death, but that social death is actually precedes the death and in a way paves the way for it, certainly in the mind of the perpetrator. You had it in the Chris Watts case where that social death was preceded by Nutgate and the fallout with between Watts's family and Shanann, right? And Shanann saying, you're never going to see your grandchildren again, and then Watts used that to his advantage based on his other sort of sideshow ideas and motives. This Saturday, I'm going to be doing a live stream on the Watts case dealing with the tricky subject of the commoditization of the Watts family murders and the Watts family by some people close to the Watts family and then also by us. So that's something to look forward to. Quite a difficult subject matter this Saturday at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Before we get to today's episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. Now, in yesterday's episode, as I say, I was pretty upset. I was pretty emotional. A lot of the reason for that is trying to understand this sense of Suzanne becoming isolated. Now, I think we can all agree that that was the case. I think we can all agree that happened. And nothing is more kind of evidence of this than on Mother's Day, she's essentially alone. Her daughters are, I guess, in Idaho on a church camp. Her husband is also elsewhere. But you have this strange analogy to the whole preceding thing where Suzanne is actually isolated on Mother's Day, and so isolated that even a year later we have no idea what happened to her, where she is. And how did that happen? It didn't just happen on Mother's Day. What happened before that? Now, it's very tempting when we look at true crime cases to paint or tar the perpetrator as all bad and the victim as all good. And as soon as we do something other than that, then we are either victim blaming. So in other words, if we say anything that's not positive or possibly negative about the victim, then we're victim blaming. And someone, I think, already made a comment on yesterday's video saying something like, you seem to be suggesting that she's responsible for her own death. And that's not what I'm suggesting at all. And I think I actually think it's quite nasty to even be putting those words in my mouth. It happened in the Watts case as well. You know, you're trying to look at the case comprehensively, thoroughly, and from all sorts of different angles. You don't want to sugarcoat things, and there is a tendency certainly from the victim's family to want to say how much I loved Suzanne, what a nice person she was, and sort of leave out the stuff that's not necessarily so positive. We weren't really getting along. I was jealous of her, or she resented me, or we had a falling out about that, or there was some estrangement. And all of that is very normal. I don't really want to, I consider it quite private, but I think it's just only fair to say, I'm estranged from my siblings. I've tried very hard to literally worked very hard to invest in my relationships with them. I've taken my sister out to dinner lots and lots of times, took her on a holiday, just did a lot, and eventually just found that it just wasn't working. And for my own sanity, I had to just stop doing that. And it's sad. It's sad because you want a cohesive family, but sometimes even those closest to you have other interests, other matters at hand, and whatever. And it pains me to say this, but that is the case. We're estranged. I fought to bring us closer together for a while, and then for my own sanity, I had to stop doing that. And it's sad. You lose someone while they're still alive. You lose someone while when you sort of wonder why is it necessary, but you can't change certain people, and I think you've got to make certain mature decisions as well. But I don't want to go into that in detail, just to say that it's normal in a way. And so I certainly am not pointing fingers and saying that's wrong or whatever, because I'm experiencing it myself. The part that I find really sad is that to some extent Suzanne was isolated because of the circumstances in Colorado, meaning because where she was living, right? But I think some of that was her own doing. And when I say that, I'm not blaming her. What I'm saying is, if you take away what ultimately happened to Suzanne, and you basically say, it was, I think, largely her decision to leave Indiana, and it may be, I have a bit of a difference of opinion to some other people. It may be that she was aware of infidelity in Indiana, and she thought going somewhere else would change that. That could be part of it. It could also be not part of it. It could also just be she had other reasons that she wanted to leave. Quite a few people close to her, paternal figures and maternal figures had passed away. 4 of them in the space of just a couple of years. And I touched on this very briefly in yesterday's video. I've got to refer to my notes here, but you basically had someone passing away in 2012, 2013, 2015, and 2016. And so after, I think her stepmother died in 2016, just 2 years later, she then, they left Indiana. And the only really remaining parent in that equation was her father, Gene. And the impression I get is that they didn't really get along that great. There was problems with unforgiveness. There was possibly certain addiction issues going on. And I think what's not acknowledged here, and this is just a theory, it's speculation. I don't really know if there's evidence of this, but based on my experience, I wonder whether, given the situation, there wasn't some kind of awareness of inheritance because of some of these paternal and maternal figures dying one by one, and then also a sibling tussle going on in the background. Not necessarily an overt bickering or whatever, but some kind of jostling for position. The one is going to inherit this and the other is going to inherit that. And I do get the impression that there was something to inherit. And the reason I'm just mentioning it is I'm um, I'm kind of experiencing something like that, but in the sense that I don't want to have anything to do with all of that bickering. I don't want to have anything to do with that posturing and gesturing and all that kind of thing. But I just wonder whether something like that hasn't happened there. In any event, it is very interesting that Suzanne chose to leave while her father was still alive. And then obviously shortly after she left, he, not shortly after, I guess, but about 2 years later, he got cancer, and then within months, he'd passed away as well. So if Suzanne hadn't disappeared, if Suzanne hadn't died, she would have survived her father and probably inherited something. But the point being that she didn't stick around waiting for him to pass. She wanted to kind of get out of there. And so I kind of get the sense that she was trying to leave Indiana for reasons besides not just wanting to find a new life somewhere else. It's also wanting to leave certain aspects behind. And some of those I think are quite private. But I think that the deaths of her stepfather, her mother, her grandmother, I think, and her stepmother, I think, gave her a sense, well, I've lost a lot of the people that I'm close to, that I love, and now I'm ready to sort of go and restart my life, right? I also don't want to seem unkind when I say that, it's disappointing what Suzanne's sister did with that really important text. Because, I've got to also say, I've gotten messages, distressing messages on my phone, obviously not quite in the same kind of context. And then I tend to delete the whole thread because I don't actually want to see it. When I turn my phone on, I just don't want to see it. Right? But I'm not deleting it because I'm worried someone else might see it. I'm deleting it because of just wanting peace of mind and not having drama and all that kind of thing. But what I want to emphasize here is, again, just with compassion and with sympathy, because I do think, if anything, family members like Melinda coming forward and sharing personal details, that's something that's to be commended, that's something to be encouraged, that's something that is that's brave and important. It's important that happens in order that there be justice in this case, right? And in so many cases in true crime, that doesn't happen. There's perhaps a sense of shame, perhaps a sense of guilt, perhaps a sense of fear that doing so is going to open Pandora's box, and people are going to throw stones and all that kind of thing. And to some extent, all of that trepidation is fair. But what's not fair is the victim. What happened to the victim? Who's going to speak for the victim? This woman who has been missing for a year. We have no idea actually what happened to her, where her remains are. Who's going to stand up for her? And the fact that a sibling has come forward means something. It means a lot. I do think sometimes it's difficult to be almost dispassionate, or to be to say certain things when you're in that situation. I've just looked at a guy talking about the Everest disaster, and he was saying, my conscience is clear, I did everything that was humanly possible. And although I think if you him, it's understandable to some extent that he would say that. If you anybody else, it's not understandable. You would think that he should have regrets or something else. And although he's not guilty of anything, it's something that you could expect is that he should feel contrition, even if he didn't technically do anything wrong. And if he did everything that was humanly possible, there should nevertheless be a sense of, I wish I could have done more. I wish I could have done that. Does that make sense? So you're not blaming someone, but I think it's also important that right beside that grief is a sense of regret. And regret doesn't mean you are liable or responsible. It simply means that because of your love and because of perhaps issues and dynamics that were unfortunately in play, it sort of tied you up, and there wasn't the sort of interaction that there could have been, right? Do you get what I'm saying? So when we deal with that deleted text from Suzanne, remember it was a really long text with we don't know exactly what the details were, but it was obviously full of drama and I guess tension, and certainly something that would cause a inner reaction in her sister, that a sense of maybe being burdened, a sense of being responsible in some way, a sense of she must now take some kind of responsibility or some kind of action. And what I want to do, and I realize it's kind of not fair because we're playing Monday morning quarterback, and it's always easy to do this in hindsight, but I nevertheless think it's important to have these thought experiments, right? So on the one hand, you can say, it's too bad that she deleted the text. To me, it's not so much about the text itself disappearing because it was recovered. That's not the issue. To me, it's the wonderful opportunity that was presented from the victim side, giving all of this information, giving all of this context, not just the context, but the timing of it. This wonderful opportunity where her life could potentially have been saved if certain things had happened. And that is the experimental nature of what we're talking about here. Is, can you imagine if there was a different response? Can you imagine if, for whatever reason, Melinda received the text and did something besides deleting it? And what I mean is, she read it perhaps to her husband. She called her pastor. Remember, she said she was going to pray about it. Imagine if she was led to communicate the contents to perhaps their pastor, or any third party, perhaps a friend or just someone that would have taken the matter further. And can you imagine if that person then had picked up the phone and intervened and called Barry and basically said, let's sort this out, and something. If Barry was in a premeditated state, if Barry was plotting and planning, and this call came through that not only had Suzanne contacted Melinda, but Melinda had spoken to other people, don't you think Barry, if he was involved, if Barry was premeditating, if he was trying to make use of this opportunity where he didn't expect that his wife would reach out to someone, where he understood that she was isolated and that those, even if she did reach out to them, would keep her isolated, wouldn't really do anything. But can you imagine if something happened where she was moved to contact someone, and someone, a pastor or a friend perhaps of Barry's, phoned him and said, dude, we need to sort this out. And can you imagine that would have set off alarm bells in a murderer's mind? Again, Barry's innocent until proven guilty, but in a scenario where this was possibly happening, can you see how it would have chased all of that away? If the cat was amongst the pigeons, the cat would have been chased away by the shocking revelation that she's already said something, that Suzanne has said something, and it's now too late. Do you get what I'm saying? So that's the one possibility, is that someone could have called. Another possibility is that someone could have spoken to Suzanne and said something like, get out of here, get out of there, or isn't there somewhere you can go and stay, or what are you doing on Mother's Day, or just kind of a conversation around her movements and what is likely to be happening. And she could have, in other words, just call her. In other words, you get this message heavy with emotion and drama, and you respond by phoning and having a direct kind of encounter, direct communication. And in that conversation, if you have a long message, why not have a long conversation? And in that conversation, oh, what are you doing on Mother's Day? Oh, what is Barry doing? What's going on? And in other words, appraising herself of the situation. Just imagine what a difference that could have made. And instead, all we're left with is this very long text, and we've got to rely on that. We've got to rely on that text for context. And it's fortunate that we've got it. It's fortunate that we do have it to rely on. Something else that I want to quickly bring up, and I realize it might be, again, quite controversial to some, the decision by her sister when she received the text was to pray about it, right? And I just want to ask the question innocently, did that help? Did receiving that particular text and then praying about it, did that help? Because we know what happened to Suzanne. And there's a saying, I think, in the Bible that God helps those who help themselves. And I think God works through action, not through, I'm not saying it doesn't work through prayers, but sometimes one's got to move beyond prayer, especially in a situation that's kind of primed, where urgency is required. Suzanne's sister also said about that text, I wasn't shocked, I wasn't surprised. She said, I could see these things developing. And that the message that she got was raw and transparent. But if that's the case, I think there was nevertheless an element of being blasé about it. I'm not going to get back to you. It's urgent, but I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that this has happened. I'm not going to get back to you. I'm going to think about it. Meanwhile, what was Suzanne going through at that time? And there's an interesting similarity with her sister and Shanann's mother, where they both have this sense, it's almost like a divine sense of knowledge, of omniscience, that something has happened, right? But then it's too late. By then it was too late. So although Melinda says something like she had a bad feeling, you might say that was some kind of divine message from above, but I actually just think it's intuition. You got this raw message, and that things are contextually unraveling, and they've developed over a long time. They've been percolating, escalating for a long time, and this is actually the moment. But I don't really want to get involved, for whatever reason, or I don't want to deal with this right now. And then what happens in that space? What happens in that gap? Well, something terrible. You had a similar situation, as I say, in the Watts case, where they could also tell something was percolating, something was brewing, something was escalating. There were tensions when Chris Watts himself was in North Carolina. They weren't sleeping in the same room. They were hardly talking to one another. But there was the sense of, well, this has happened before. They've argued before. Shanann is sometimes a bit pushy, and Watts withdraws, and it's all perfectly normal. But what they weren't anticipating was that this was the end game of that whole thing. Which is why when you sometimes see family members go on Dr. Phil or go on television, they tell the story about how perfect and wonderful and happy and great everything was. It's not very helpful, because we want to know how it went from that perfect picture to this thing that happened. And it didn't happen by a fluke. It didn't just happen. It's something that evolves and devolves. It's dysfunction that takes root and eventually becomes something, it manifests, right? And often you can see it happening. You can see it happening slowly, slowly, slowly. And then when something happens at the end of it, maybe it's a surprise. But I don't think you can say it's totally unpredictable. It's totally unseeable. It's only unseeable if you're not paying attention. It's only unpredictable if you're not meditating on it. And consider what is happening. One person, the killer, is premeditating. Other people, family members, people who are perhaps estranged, are blocking this person out or not thinking about them or not dealing with it right then. And all of that falls into it favors a potential perpetrator. It favors foul play. Because there had to have been a reason in this particular case that this particular perpetrator thought he could get away with what he was doing. And it seems, certainly up until this point, that he did pretty well. He got away with it for quite a long time. And perhaps even in his own mind, he thought he did manage to get away with it until he was charged. But what made him think he would have the opportunity? And I think the answer is that she was isolated in more ways than have kind of been acknowledged. Melinda did mention something about Andy being upset with Suzanne. I think it had something to do with a loan, if I understood that part correctly. And that's something I've definitely experienced as well, is where your siblings are being favored in some way materially through money or through some kind of, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, payments, loans, discounts, whatever you want to call it. And so one sibling needs money or needs help or something, but then what about the others? And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with one sibling saying, what about me? Because, even at the stage where you're very little children, it's important that a child not allow his or her sibling to get the better of them. It's important. And the reason for that is when they are out of the family structure and someone else is competing with them, some kind of rival or whatever, they need to keep their place in the sun. They need to make sure that the status quo is appropriate. And so if in your own family you allow a sibling to benefit at your expense, or that you don't get the benefit that you should be getting, if you're not going to fight for that, it's a healthy narcissism in that extent. But you can also understand how that kind of thing can, certainly as adults, can start to unravel and become dark and unpleasant, especially if you don't communicate and get clarity, and you start to allow little cracks and schisms to form and certain assumptions to take root. Does that make sense? So I just want you guys to be aware that when we do this, when we try and establish the genuine family dynamics, the point of it isn't to blame anyone. It's to understand what happened. The point of it is really to understand the criminal psychology on the other side of it, who's trying to take advantage of some of these breakdowns in family relationships, right? That's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to say you are wrong, or you are bad, or I don't like you, or you should have done that, or anything like that. We're trying to understand. This is a true crime channel. We're trying to understand the whole network, the whole spider web, and what the spider did with that web to, catch his prey and spin his yarns, making. And I think Melinda said something along the lines that Barry would say things that were true, but that would reflect well on him, but some, badly on Suzanne's family. So, for example, I think he said something like, they weren't there for her cancer. When she had cancer, they didn't actually come and see her, or something like that. And so that would reflect well on him, but not on them. But then there were other things that did reflect well on them, such as Suzanne trusting her sister with this last message, trusting that she would do something with it, and she has, trusting that, sending it to her would in some way help her, save her. It would be something that would ultimately improve her situation. Another thing that I thought was really interesting, again from a true crime perspective, was Barry contacting Jean something like a week, but very shortly after Suzanne disappeared. And he was then already asking for guardianship, I guess, over some of her assets and so on. And how Melinda quotes it is, Barry apparently said to Jean, Jean, I loved your daughter. And Jean quickly pounced on the statement, saying, noticing that he'd said loved in the past tense. So true. So that was a big warning sign. And if Jean was still alive, I'm certain that he would be called to testify, and he would be called to testify specifically on that. Probably Melinda will, kind of on his behalf. But anyway, the upshot of that was Jean was suspicious of Barry and said, I'm not signing anything. I'm not quite sure what happened. I'm not sure what happened, but Barry was ultimately able to sell the house, so I don't know how the guardianship thing was resolved. I don't know if he did eventually sign something or if someone signed on his behalf. I don't know. Now, I did say I want to talk about passive-aggressive. It was something that was not brought up by me. It was brought up on this other channel. I want to talk about where it comes from, how it manifests, and its role in true crime, specifically in this case. I meant to do it in this video. I just felt that there was an aspect to the previous video that I hadn't properly dealt with, and so I feel like that's been done now. So I'll be dealing with the passive-aggressive psychology, how it relates to this case, in the next video. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.